Hello. Here in History 17A, we are moving on to slavery, all right, in the antebellum period. Early Republic and antebellum period, all right. So here with slavery, we have the handout, and yeah. So it begins with a refutation of Fogel and Ingerman's book, Time on the Cross. They had an interesting thesis, all right, and that is because slaves constituted a heavy, expensive investment, and because planters were capitalists, adventurers who wanted to maximize their profits, they relatively took good care of the material state of their slaves. All right. So no different from a horse or a tractor or whatever else they would contend that you have made as a heavy investment. You want it to work as efficiently as possible. All right. So certainly not out of humanitarianism and not out of the Southern gentry notion of paternalism either, but self-interest. All right. So clearly a number one, we're going against that thesis. All right. So with number one, first of all, what I start off with is data to remind the reader of psychological torment that slaves underwent, because, that doesn't directly apply to and refute their thesis because they stuck to the material realm, but still, it's a very convenient omission, not getting into the psychological suffering of the slaves. So, I mean, where to begin, right? As far as slaves being chattel property under the law, movable property, inherited um, for life, deliberately making it difficult, one colony in one state after another, for emancipation to happen, all right, with the necessitating the approval of the right authorities and so forth. So at any rate, the slave codes in and of themselves were quite harsh. Raising your hand to the master, you could be direly punished. The second time, you could be killed. Same thing with the second time that you're found uh, wandering off your plantation without the proper papers, and the list goes on. So, but what I began with was the tearing asunder of the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids. They, yes, you do. You look at some of the old school books on slavery, and they will contend that there were instances. There were always exceptions, right? There were instances in which masters or planters were mindful of marriages and tried to keep the husband and wife together, mindful of their children, and with the same intent of trying to keep them together. Again, not always out of paternalism, not always out of humanitarianism, but sometimes out of just self-interest, believing that they would get the best of their slaves if they were not miserably trying to escape and find their loved ones. But nevertheless, we also know, from Uncle Tom's Cabin, etc. Sometimes it was systematic. Sometimes we've gone over the alleged good intentions of Thomas Jefferson and continually becoming indebted and in need of selling a slave or in need of keeping the slaves up and through his death for collateral. And so, whether it was systematic and economic, or sometimes we know from primary sources that sometimes it was personal, that masters could and did kind of sway their weight around and use the threat of family separation as a kind of a cudgel that they were willing to swing and use to keep them in line. And of course, the stereotype of the women, right, not giving into the sexual overtures of the master or of the overseer, and thus being threatened to be separated from their children if they weren't compliant. We have primary sources that attest to that. As far as frequency, that's another question. So that's what I do at first, is I show the psychological torment of families being torn asunder by sales, and being separated from one another. And then you also have the contention that slaves were granted the mere minimum as far as their calorie and protein intake, just enough, right, to keep them going and to supposedly keep them efficient as workers, but not one drop more. All right. We have quotes from George Washington and others who attested to this. I don't know how they got access to this information, but they contend that the calorie and protein intake of slaves, right, was merely 25% of that of their white masters. So they weren't eating like their white masters. That's for sure. And look what this gentleman says here. We used to steal meat whenever we could get a chance, and such was my craving for it, that if the punishment had been death, I could not have resisted the temptation. So to me, that smacks of desperation, that slaves could be so hungry that they'd be willing to risk their lives, literally, to acquire some extra food. Okay, so we have that on there as well. Um, and then I have more instances of that. And then in addition to that, we have evidence in their showing their discontent, right? If they were treated so well, then why were they so discontented? And there's just plenty of evidence of that. We're going to get into on a subsequent number their culture and how it kind of let off steam as far as showing their frustration and their misery. You have them acting in acts of desperation, trying to escape the plantation, trying to catch other food, trying to, there are a myriad of things that they tried to do in defiance of the slave codes. And why would they do that, I would ask, if their material needs were met so well and they were relatively materially comfortable, et cetera, et cetera. And then as far as materially comfortable, they even try to give a quote in saying that the average slave was perhaps receiving just one whipping per year. And they only do the Barrow Plantation in Louisiana, which is far from being broad enough of a spectrum of data to draw from, to draw conclusions from. But just one more weakness in their book. But at any rate, they contend, right, that it was just supposedly just once a year on average. But of course, you could ask, isn't once a year too much? So anyway, all right. So then moving on to number two. Facets of humanity were evident in slave culture. All right. This, by the way, you see my footnotes here. John Blassingame, The Slave Community, Plantation Life in the Antebellum South. This is such an interesting and factually rich book. It's incredible. It's so fun to read, but also depressing. And it gets into the slaves and in using their agency in devising their own subculture. All right. And with that subculture, you see a lot of the spectrum of human feelings, the human psyche, etc. So that I dare to say that if we tried to put ourselves in the shoes of the slaves, a lot of that which they did culturally might make perfect sense to us as fellow human beings. So you have here, they devised behavior and beliefs to mitigate their burden of oppression, to establish group solidarity, to safely vent their anger, to sustain hope, to build up self-esteem, and to devise a world of escape free from the control of whites. Okay. So, for instance, the slaves were allowed, and there were concessions, okay, given to the slaves. Sundays and holidays they would sometimes have off. Harvest time, they would relax their requirements for leaving the plantation, and they would allow slaves and loved ones from adjacent plantations to come and meet together to engage in the harvesting activities. And then when they were done, they would have music, they would have athletic competitions, they would have dancing, and other types of recreation. All right. But in doing it, looking at their recreation, right, you see some cold hard truths, all right, in some of their skits and songs, etc. So notice one song was "Run Inward Run." Okay. Um, Another thing that they would do, I have the quote in here somewhere where it says, "Master sleeps on a feather bed while I sleep on the floor." Okay. Their dancing consisted of wild gyrations in dance style, a furiously defiant and lascivious tone. It smacked of rebellion and catharsis. All right. Remember, catharsis is like hitting a punching bag. It's a non-harmful, safe way of venting your emotions, and largely your negative emotions. Okay. But notice this, they had sarcasm in some of their writings and in some of their cultural constructs. So there you have it right there. Massa sleeps in the feather bed, the inward sleeps on the floor. All right. But what they also do is they make up these fables, and they were very, very thinly disguised. Oftentimes, the protagonist was enslaved. He was weaker than the opponent, than the adversary, but he oftentimes was shrewd. He was very cunning, and he was able to outwit the stronger bully, if you will. And of course, right, it doesn't take much to kind of associate that as a somewhat of an autobiographical Freudian slip. All right. So they have that as well. And then they had music that predated the blues, depressing, sad, melancholy music, bemoaning their misery. And of course, they also made heroes of people like Saint Malo and others who had fought back against the white man. They lionized them as heroes, okay, in their music and in their writings, etc. They had the ring shout, and the ring shout encouraged one another to participate in the black church, because oftentimes they had to go to uh, a chaperoned white church, but they could earn the right to have their own separate black services supplemental to that. All right. And then when they did, oftentimes there was encouragement. There were a lot of allusions to the book of Exodus, whereby God has pity on the Hebrew people because they're enslaved by the Pharaoh, and he helps them to gain their freedom. Okay, so once again, some major Freudian slips coming through in their culture. All right. Slave folk tales, often under the metaphor of a small, seemingly helpless animal pitted against a predatory, large, and powerful beast, encouraged hope and patience, and not only overcoming their obstacles, but their masters and overseers as well. Okay, once again, through cunning. They snuck out of through chimney holes to go and meet loved ones, illegally leaving the plantation. Um, they uh, they would tie up um, the paths that the slave patrols would use, so the horses would trip over whatever substance it was, I forget what it was that they used to tie to the different trees. And so some of it smacked of almost overt rebellion. Okay, some of their culture and some of their practices and behavior. Sometimes they would go to witch doctors, right? And they would ask for curses upon the overseer. Remember, the overseer oftentimes was a hired man to, and oftentimes hired to be the hated middleman. The planter would often tell him, "I want A, B, and C done in this finite amount of time, and if not, it's your job that's lost." And so it was kind of they were set up to be the hated middleman, incurring the quote discipline on a daily basis of the whip, etc. Okay. Slaves created a subculture conducive to rebellion and antagonism. They prized loyalty to and honesty and solidarity with one another. So you were not to rat on one another in slave culture, right? Even if that person was in the wrong. And so they encouraged dishonesty. And remember, Thomas Jefferson had said that. He said that, when you put someone in such an utterly hopeless, helpless situation, you're going to create sycophants. You're going to create slaves that are going to be dishonest with you. They're going to be sneaky. They're going to be opportunistic. And it's your fault for putting them in such a seemingly helpless situation, extracting that from them. Okay. Then number three, lessons on power in the early Republic South. Now, this is very generalized. I hope that it was somewhat fair of me to do as far as putting together a generic formula, but here we go. So for one, right, slaves were not untouched by popular culture. Popular culture hit republicanism, hit the Enlightenment, hit against tyranny, hit for egalitarianism, everyone on the same equal footing, hit individual natural rights during the War for Independence and just after. And so that penetrated the slave community and it could get their hopes up. All right. Another thing that could happen to as a recipe for a rebellion is to have some type of leadership of someone who has reason to believe that there not only is hope, but that he or she uh, has the rare qualities of leadership to be able to head it at the top. And so when you look at Gabriel Prosser in 1802, you look at Denmark Vesey in 1824, you look at Nat Turner around 1836, um, these were not average dudes. They were looked upon for their appearance. They were exceptionally impressive in appearance. They were skilled at some type of work, and hence they were given some amount of liberty and some hope in advancement. Um, one common thing to do was to send them to rent their services out as an artisan, as a skilled worker in the nearby southern cities. So this happened in Richmond, Virginia. It happened in Charleston, South Carolina. And what do you know? That's where some of the biggest slave revolt conspiracies were devised. And then, not to mention, they got to rub elbows with free blacks, free white artisans, and others that they worked on terms of equality with in the cities, and they developed a rapport with them. And so, in the case of Gabriel Prosser, the white artisans contended that they were going to help free the slaves. Then you also had the election of 1800 and the hyperbole that was going on at that time, so that people thought there might be a civil war between the conservatives and the liberals. And so slaves around Gabriel Prosser were planning and hoping for that eventuality as an open door for them to rebel and to side with the liberals. Okay. And Denmark Vesey, in his case, he got to see the world. He got to go out on a ship and work as a shipsman. And so he got to see other countries, he got to see other peoples and ethnicities, and it broadened his horizons. It's probably no coincidence that the leader of the Haitian rebellion, right, amongst the slaves in Haiti, also was anomalously educated and well traveled and well read. And so you get leadership from such men. Okay. So notice, right, when you give them hope through something that is percolating in popular culture, you give them personal hope and giving them advancement and giving them a little bit of latitude to go into the city and work as if they're a free artisan amongst the free artisans that they worked with. You're giving them hope. You're enhancing their self-esteem. You're broadening their horizons, and that sometimes can lead to a rebellion. All right. And now note this is given from a premise that it takes a certain level of hope and expectation, individual and collective self-esteem, uh, to be able to have the nerve to revolt. Because, there's a simple thesis to the contrary that some would contend, and that is that it's the demographics that are completely crushed and have never been treated as if they were any better, never been given an advancement, never given any freedom or latitude to move into a city and live there for periods of time and do work and get a taste of freedom. And notice I just didn't go that route on this number. Instead, I'm operating from the other premise that there has to be a level of collective and individual self-esteem, and there have to be sources of hope to grant them their willingness to risk their lives in rebelling. And then in the case of Denmark Vesey, they were going to burn Charleston, South Carolina to the ground, and then they were going to go to Haiti. Yeah. So again, their connection to the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s. All right. In both cases, a house slave, a domestic slave, told on them, and they were caught before they could come into fruition. Nat Turner was different. Nat Turner actually engaged in a rebellion. Um, but yeah, so at any rate, and that's another subtopic that we could have gone further into, the whole Uncle Tom phenomenon of loyal house slaves. But it wasn't always that way. Clearly, right? They contend that when you're in such intimate quarters with your white family, that there was a daily dose of humiliation, condescension, arrogance, that these house slaves were victimized by, that made them a source of great unrest. Right. So at any rate, moving on then to number 3 or number 4. Wait a second. Did I skip one? Pardon me. No, I guess there are 4. Sorry about that. So number 4, on the alleged utility of Christianity amongst the slaves. What a fascinating topic, right? As you may recall from the colonial time period, South Carolina told the Anglican missionaries to the slaves, you literally must extract from the Bible the book of Exodus, where God helps the slaves gain their freedom against the Egyptians. Okay. You have some in the antebellum period quotes that you could find in some of the more popular books on slavery by like Kenneth Stamp and other writers, Stanley Elkins and other big writers on slavery, whereby white masters and observers contended that it was in their best interest, selfishly, to Christianize and convert the slaves, right? And you could see why with certain aspects of Christianity, all right? So for one, right, when Jesus was asked by Pilate, are you the king of the Jews? Are you this awaited Messiah? Because as you probably know, there was a 300 to 400 year interim between the days of the Old Testament and the New Testament being written, and whereby God was allegedly somewhat silent and didn't use any prophets. And in that time, uh, the Jews also were being spread and throughout much of the old world. And so that's when they established the synagogues, and they would grab oftentimes just a little portion of scripture, like the book of Isaiah or Jeremiah or something, right? And they would give kind of homilies or sermons on them. And they devised a lot of Pharisaical rules and Pharisaical interpretations to the scripture that they had hands on. And one of those interpretations was that the Messiah was going to be this power wielding king that would come and overthrow the Jewish people, the Hebrews, enemies and oppressors, uh, uh, just overcome them with an iron scepter, with an iron um, weapon. But that's not the case with Christianity, right? According to the New Testament and many denominations of Christianity to this day, the people in the synagogues got it wrong. That the Messiah came to die for people's sins so that they go to a good place after they die, not to come and overthrow Rome from upon the Jewish people. So when he was asked if he was the king of the Jews, right, knowing those kind of militaristic interpretations to the Messiah, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. So don't worry, Pilate. I'm not here for an insurrection amongst the Jews. My mind is on things eternal." So you also have Christ saying, right, to turn the other cheek. If someone strikes you in the face, turn them and offer them the other cheek as well, and to take the high road. You have verses by St. Paul that say, "Slaves, be obedient to your masters." It's right here. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor while their eye is upon you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God sincerely from your heart. Serve them wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you whatever good you do, whether slave or free." So my point being is there was reason for the primary sources indicating that some white Southerners believed, or perhaps many, that that Christianity could become a good Vicodin pill for the slaves, calm them down, make them more docile, waiting for death in heaven instead of trying to bring about some type of insurrection in heaven on earth. Okay, so there and what I'm saying in here as well is there was some truth to that. You do have evidence of slaves during the Civil War remaining on the plantations when they had plenty of chances to leave and showing loyalty to the dying end to their planters and to even to some of their the foremen, the hated middleman. And so we know that. We have cases of slaves bragging with one another in competitive fashion that their master is a better man than the other slave's master. And so them taking this vicarious sense of identity and pride in their master. And so, so absolutely, there is some evidence that the quote softness of Christianity uh, had its effect on many slaves. All right. However, it's not that simplistic. So you also have, right, certain points of scripture that would encourage slaves to gain a sense of entitlement. All right. And I don't mean entitlement in a negative sense, but feel as if, hey, wait a minute, I'm a human being and I'm entitled to certain rights and opportunities myself. So that verse that I read, I cut it off, as did the Southerners. After that, it says, and this is a loose paraphrase, and masters, be kind to your slaves, for you know that you have a heavenly master that basically watches everything you do, and you'll be held accountable for how you treat them. All right. Then, in addition to that, you have in the book of Acts, Peter believed, as did many of the disciples, being Jewish people, having the Messiah being introduced through Jewish prophets, and of Christ himself being Jewish, that salvation came from the Jews, right? But Peter has that famous vision where he sees unclean animals, and God tells him in his dream to eat the unclean animals. And he first says, never, my Lord, that's not kosher. That's against the Levitical laws. And God says to him, what I've made clean, may no one declare unclean. And it was meant to be a metaphor because at that point he had a Roman centurion or a high ranking Roman come to his house, and he was told that he was to give the gospel to that Roman, and that God wanted that Roman soul to become saved. All right. And Peter says to a crowd, right, basically in a loose paraphrase, I was under the assumption that salvation was only for us Jews. But now I know that God accepts every man from every nation who fears him and who draws near. And so you have verses like that that suggest that Christianity is very cosmopolitan. It's not restricted to certain ethnicities, certain ages, certain socioeconomic strata, certain genders, etc. Right? That it was supposed to be all encompassing. That any man who comes to Christ can be saved. So at any rate, those verses, that if they become familiar with those might become very powerful to the slaves and thinking, wait a minute, God made me as he made the white man. And the Bible says when he made everything, he saw that it was good and declared his creation to be good. And that includes me as a black man. Okay. And so at any rate, it did empower some African slaves. They held their head up higher. They were less inclined to take abuse and injustices in refusing to turn the other cheek. Some made demands and ultimatums, etc. So it did kind of, embolden some of the slaves, their reception of Christianity. And then, of course, some went to the further extent whereby they engaged in outright rebellion, right? And contended that the Judeo-Christian God was on their side and was helping them win their freedom, all right? And a case of that, I wish we had more time to get into because I don't have my notes here with me, is Nat Turner and his rebellion in the 1830s. He contended to be divinely inspired, all right? So that's my thesis there. All right. And another thing that I found interesting in the book is some of the slaves felt like they had a psychological edge and a moral high ground when they accepted Christianity. So, for instance, I kid you not, according to multiple authors on this topic of slavery, uh, it was not uncommon for masters to call in their slaves on their deathbed and to ask for their forgiveness, fearing that they were about to go to hell once they died. And they felt themselves at the mercy of the slaves, almost feeling as if the slaves wouldn't forgive him, neither would his God. All right. And so it did. It gave the slaves sort of a sense of power that they were on the high road. And that's why in their devised religion and culture, their derivation of Christianity, they, Jesus had said, right, that we're going to be surprised in heaven that those who are last here shall become the first up there, and those who are first and in charge down here will be the last up in heaven. And so, in that topsy-turvy type of hierarchy, the slaves believed that they were going to be in higher positions in heaven for what they had suffered than their white counterparts. I thought that was interesting. So at any rate, all right. And yes, they got their hands on the book of Exodus. Are there any questions? All right. All right. Well, you guys have a great week and good luck on this, okay?